Good morning, everybody. Welcome to number 31. Apologies if I sound terrible. This is me recording the video in the morning after I stayed up till 5 a.m. watching the MSI series last night, which was good. I would recommend it if you are interested. But yeah, if I sound really terrible, that's probably why. So let's start out talking through these four topics I've added here at the top. These are just some things that I thought were or like good topics that I'm either talking with people in like my Discord or DMs or whatever right now about, or recent topics of discussion that I thought would make good Q&A topics, and so I've put them here at the top, and then I'll probably add some stuff to the bottom of the document, get some new topics from the section on my Discord, probably for number 32. So let's get in there. Starting out here, we've got Shaco Escape. This is a topic that came up. I was talking on my stream a little bit about this, and I believe Quacks made a short about it as well. Talking about, basically summarizing what I said was, someone came into my chat and was like, "Hey, could Shaco, Shaco have a better escape, right?" And my answer is basically like probably not, because AD Shaco, is tuned around having some of the worst escapability for uh, a like for an assassin. Couple things I really want to note here is I didn't say this, but number one, I was talking specifically about AD Shaco. Obviously, AP Shaco actually is one of the most highly escapable champions in the game, and that's because this AP Shaco is not bound to use Q offensively, right? And in exchange, AP Shaco doesn't get to make offensive actions, right? Right. That's the power trade-off between, or one of the biggest power trade-offs between the two builds, is that AP Shaco can Q towards someone and actually make an aggressive action upon them, whereas AP Shaco doing the same thing is basically a waste of your time most of the time, right? You have to have the opponent come to you and step onto your boxes. And so you're great at controlling a space, but you're not actually good at taking offensive actions in the same way that AD Shaco is. And AD Shaco not having an escape, or not being good at escaping, uh, part of this is like, I recognize, yes, there are situations where even as AD Shaco, your W or your R might enable you to escape. But the powerful thing that AD Shaco does is Q forwards. And when you compare this to other AD assassin kits, AD Shaco both has a lot more effective, like, universal reach, right? It's like, when you think about it, when you consider this, it's like, look at what Talon would have to do to do the same thing, right? He has to like flip over a wall and R, and that's honestly arguably less effective at getting to the target in a lot of cases than just Shaco's one basic ability with not a ultimate level of cooldown, right? Think about someone like Zed. One of the big things is that our other AD assassins tell you that they're coming most of the time, right? It's like, sure, if you get close to a bush that they're in, or they're in fog, and you get close to them, obviously they're very powerful, and in fact in many cases a lot more powerful than Shaco is, right? But Shaco, from fog even a decent distance away, right? When you compare to someone like Rengar, whose ult tells you he's coming, and otherwise he has to jump from a brush, Talon, who can jump over walls and all of that, right? But stealth is very short duration and leaves a giant ring. So if he stealths anywhere close to where you can see him, you can see the ring of blades, and he's coming, and that gives you some time to prepare. Zed, Kiana, who have to actually like approach you in vision, right? They have you know dashes that they can use to cover a lot of distance, but they still forewarn you that they're coming, right? Vision range is a lot longer than their engage range, et cetera, right? Shaco can actually engage from outside of your vision, just normally in fog, and doesn't give you any warning that he's coming, right? And I think this was the original idea behind the poof that he used to have in Fog of War. Of course, the counterplay on that is pretty questionable, right? Because like, how often are people actually looking at Fog of War, and I think that it was probably good for us to remove that, because I just don't think it made that much sense structurally. But anyway, wrapping around to the actual point I'm getting at here, basically, what I'm trying to say is that, yes, situationally, AD Shaco has an escape, but the core thing that I'm getting at here is that his escapability is tuned against how good is his target access and how reliably does he kill his target. I think that in terms of how reliably he actually kills his target, he's like pretty high, right? Like, auto attacks are one of the most powerful and reliable ways you can kill someone. Obviously, Shaco's a lot less powerful if he's not backstabbing someone, but he has a lot of tools, right, with his Q to set up that he's going to backstab you in a lot of cases. And of course, if you're moving away from him, you're going to get backstabbed if he's auto attacking you. And so anyway, I sort of look at assassin power budgeting, and a lot of the power budgeting can be kind of summed up with three simple categories. How reliable are they at getting to their target? How reliable are they at killing their target when they get there? and how good are they at getting away after they after they do those things, right? Because obviously it's also powerful to not have to die when you assassinate someone in like a 3v3 or 5v5 or whatever, right? And when you look at Shaco, most of the power budget goes in, you're going to be able to get to your target, and you do a lot of reliable damage to them when you do get to them. And so there's not a lot of power budget left over for getting away after you do those things, right? Same thing with Rengar, right? Rengar, like basically all of his power is in reliably killing the target. He even warns you that he's coming, right? That's the Rengar specific thing that he has, is he tells you he's coming most of the time, that he's going to try and assassinate you, but still, though, if he gets to you, a lot of the time that's still going to result in your death, unless you have like a GA or Zonia's, or you have a lot of teammates nearby, or you have a lot of armor, or you've built a little bit like more meaningfully durable than most squishy champions. And so basically what I'm getting at here is different champions have their power budgeted in different ways, and if we wanted to give Shaco a really reliable escape, like as an AD champion, like for example Q resetting on takedown, the reality is that power budget would have to come from other areas, and that's a really massive amount of power, like giving him a reliable way to escape after he's killed his target. And so he would have to have a lot like a lot lower reliability at getting to the target, or be a lot less good at killing his target, right? Ultimately, a lot like with a lot of these things, like could this champion have this thing? The answer is, well, the thing that you're asking for would cost so much power budget that it's not even like probably not even going to feel like the same champion after we do that level of power budget shifting, is kind of how I look at this. And so hopefully that's a pretty understandable way of putting it. So another thing I was talking about on stream recently was Blade of the Ruined King, and what champions should buy it, like how the item is structured, what's what it's intended to do, etc. And I just want to talk a little bit about that here, because one of the things I was talking about with Viego, I think I didn't fully explain particularly well on the stream, was talking about how Viego, like, yeah, absolutely, from a thematic perspective, right? He is the Ruined King, and that's the Blade of the Ruined King. It would make a lot of sense if he built it from a theme perspective. But from a gameplay perspective, we gave Viego a lot of the properties of Orc, right? Where, for example, he has current health, and he has innate sustain. And it turns out that when you already have those things, it's a lot less valuable to be getting them from the item store, right? The reality is here that when you already have a lot of a linearly scaling thing, and especially for someone like Viego, who is a champion who has current health damage, but actually mostly wants the ability to finish targets off, something like Blade of the Ruined King, structurally, like the way that the item is positioned in our current systems, doesn't really make that much sense for him, right? Like Viego, like junglers in general, like why would they ever care about lifesteal? Right, what about lifesteal is appealing to a jungler? How are you getting value from sustain, right? As a jungler, when the jungle doesn't really ask you to have any sustain, the jungle pet will handle that problem for you. And even when you're talking about lane Viego, uh, when you're thinking about, say, uh, how Viego plays outside of the laning phase, you kind of have to ask yourself, okay, so what's the purpose of this champion, right? What's your goal? And the answer is to get one kill. And then the question becomes, okay, so Blade of the Ruined King, which is an awesome item on Viego in lane, right? Like specifically in the laning phase, right? The build path gives you lifesteal, you get more sustain, you can scrap it out, especially with higher HP targets. It's pretty nice for wearing them down. It's like, but outside of the laning phase, right? What is it doing for you? And the answer, comparatively to something like a Kraken Slayer, is not that much, because the whole point of Viego is that your item build doesn't really matter once you get the first kill. And so if your item doesn't really help you get the first kill or survive until you get the first kill, it's like, well, Blade of the Ruined King is an item with no defenses on it at all that offers you like over time sustain. Um, this is not the item structure that's actually powerful for a Viego, that is trying to play into the main win condition of burst one target, get a kill, burst the next target, get more kills, and then chain throughout the fight, right? And so a lot of this just comes down to the way that Viego's kit being structured says an on-hit item that offers current health is really not going to be that attractive to him, especially not if it has also lifesteal on it, which is not a particularly valuable stat for Viego's main role in the jungle, right? I think there's a stronger argument for lifesteal, or like just generally sustain in the laning phase, of course, right? Viego's a melee champion that takes a lot of harass, just farming out waves and so on. But anyway, getting at the point here, you have to be asking for Blade of the Ruined King what does your champion actually need to do, right? And if the answer isn't fight people from high levels of HP and stay on the map for a long time, uh, the answer is probably not build a Blade of the Ruined King, right? When you look at someone like Aurelia as an example, who I would say is the highest synergy Blade of the Ruined King user in the game right now, she has special synergy with lifesteal and is a laner, right? Who cares a lot about being able to shrug off harass, and she actually also really needs to be able to interact with people at full HP. Right, that's actually really, really, really important for her, and she has a lot of other tools that she can use to finish people off on her kit. But taking advantage of the current health damage on Bork is actually pretty easy for her, like starting with auto attacks and ending with spells. Right, that's actually pretty easy for Aurelia. She can just auto attack you to death with the damage from her passive and her auto attacks and all of that, right? And that's not structurally why, or like it's not structurally how someone like Viego or say like Kale work. Now, none of this is to say, like, I do want to be clear about this. Like, none of this is to say that I think that Bork is perfect, right? In fact, I think that the way that our entire on-hit system, I've talked about this a number of times before, but the way that the entire on-hit system is currently structured is not ideal. And, as an example, one of the examples that I commonly use here is like, we have an item called Kraken Slayer, but it's actually the anti-squishy early on-hit option, whereas Blade of the Ruined King is the anti-durable target, and that doesn't really make sense, right? But we don't need to get into all of that. Ultimately, what I'm trying to get at here, or sort of what I'm trying to get across here, is that when I think about Bork, and I think about the champions that want it or should want it in its current structure, you need a lot of different things, like different properties, right? You should want to be able to kill people from full HP and specifically deal a lot of damage with your auto attacks to someone at full HP, right? Champions that actually front load their burst with spells actually don't really want Blade of the Ruined King, even if they don't have synergy with on hits, because of course Blade of the Ruined King is at its most effective if you're fighting people at high levels of HP. You also really need to want lifesteal, right? Because there's a pretty meaningful amount of power budget in that lifesteal. And so someone like a Viego, right, in his main role, where lifesteal is not a very good stat for junglers, isn't going to want that, right? Now, Master Yi, I think, is an interesting exception. The lifesteal is not particularly great on him, but it's mostly that the other options don't have kind of like poor synergy with the way that his Q functions and such, or have poor synergy with his game plan of like approaching people from high levels of HP. And so the fact that Bork lets you is like one of the most effective items in the game from fighting someone from full HP or for fighting someone from full HP is appealing to Master Yi, even if he's not the best person to leverage or champion to leverage the lifesteal. Anyway, to kind of wrap up this topic in general, what I would say is that uh, there are lots of things about Bork that make sense structurally. If you look at the item in an individual basis, like if you don't consider the positioning of the other on hit items in our systems, but I think that when you look at its position relative to other items, like say Kraken Slayer, especially, but even things like Rageblade or Wit's End, I think that there's definitely something about the way that it's positioned right now that feels kind of off to me around, hey, the use cases for this feel pretty restrictive, right? In the past, before Kraken Slayer existed, we could actually just juice Bork up because the champions that couldn't use the lifesteal didn't have other options, and so we could just tune them around, just getting a bit of extra, getting more efficient access to lifesteal. But now we have to tune those champions around an item that doesn't have that stat and gets to be a little bit more juiced up in other areas, via Kraken Slayer, and that I think actually makes tuning Bork a little bit more difficult because in the previous game it was the premier first on hit item, and there really weren't a lot of competitors to that. And this is like prior to the mythic system, prior to Kraken Slayer existing, and the existence of other items has kind of taken over some of the Bork niche that previously I think it occupied sort of because there wasn't anything else there, and we could just tune champions to be a little bit more powerful when they were building, when their highest synergy item was Bork first, because there wasn't something that was actually tailored specifically for them. And so there is something that was lost, I think, as part of that process. But ultimately, I kind of look at Bork and I say, look, it does what it's, mostly what it's supposed to do. it's maybe not doing that in the best way possible. And yeah, I think there's probably we could probably benefit from shifting some stats around or reconsidering exactly the way that some of the on hit items are positioned. Healing versus damage. So this is a topic that August I think was talking about recently on stream, and I think Quack's made a short of him talking about it, and so I had some people asking me about this topic. And the sort of root question here is basically, hey, if insert random champion here can do 60k damage in a game, why can't Soraka do 60k healing? And the short answer is that the way that typical, like what I would call traditional MOBAs are designed is that we have a lot of defenders advantages and we don't have a lot of hard forcing functions for ending the game, right? Ultimately, we want people who get strong to progress the game towards an ending state, right? Like whether that's them winning or losing, right? Like we want the powerful things, the people who are getting to be more and more powerful, generally speaking, to be able to make actions towards a resolution of the game. And the reason why we need that is that when we don't have a lot of those things, when the game isn't structured in such a way that that is the case, we end up in these awkward situations where we have games that just go really, really, really long. Let me explain why, right? Like look at the base structure in a traditional MOBA, right? Like League's map obviously is one of these, right? Where you have the Nexus. That's what, that's your lose condition is losing your Nexus. Look at how close that is to the fountain, right? Like you spawn there, you heal there. There's obviously a massive defender's advantage close to the Nexus, right? And so the more and more uh, you get towards the like actual resolution of the game, the larger and larger advantage the defender has in a lot of ways, right? The defender has full vision in their base. The lanes are very close together, in the base, right? You can easily rotate between inhibitor towers as the defender, right? Whereas it's a bit more difficult as the attacker, right? You're less advantaged there. You have a vision disadvantage, right? Like look at all of the defenders' advantages we have in League and in basically all sort of traditional MOBAs, right? And there's no forcing function that says, as example, hey, at 25 minutes, we snap our fingers and whoever has the most structures wins, right? A lot of other games out there, right, have forcing functions like this, and even some games that are MOBA adjacent but not traditional MOBAs, right? Like for example, HOTS has a lot of like forcing functions like this in a lot of their maps, are designed in such a way that yeah, it's inevitable that someone will end, right? Like the game will be forced to end time wise because this thing will just get activated X number of times and it ramps, or one of the teams will just die after X number of activations or whatever, right? And traditional MOBAs don't have those forcing functions. And so it's actually extremely critical that when someone is scaling their power throughout the game, that the most powerful scaling thing that you can be doing is damage, right? Or at least something that progresses the game towards an ending state, right? Because if the most powerful things in the game, or the most equivalent things in the game, are healing or durability outputs, that is very likely to lead to states where you like the game stalls out and it's very difficult for people to progress, right? Because damage, obviously, like when you kill someone, when you do more damage than someone else and you just have like very clear damage advantages on them, their win conditions often become very clear. Oh, we need to CC that person, or we need to play away from that person, like we need to split the map, etc. Right? Whereas when your healing or your durability outscale, often your ability to make like enact your will and progress the game towards a desired ending state is going to be very minimal to potentially nothing, right? If you have the exact same amount of like typical like average healing is typically the same as a damage dealer, the question then becomes, okay, number one, what's the counterplay to you here? Like how does that work, right? Soraka has this built into her kit, obviously, where you have to hit enemies with your Q, and that exposes you to risk, et cetera, et cetera. Otherwise it costs your health, and you can only heal allies and not yourself. We don't need to get into all of that, but generally speaking, what I'm trying to get at here is that it is important that the most powerful scaling things in traditional MOBAs are damage, because if something else is really powerful, specifically durability or sustain, are the most powerful things that you can be doing in terms of scaling throughout the game. What that means is that when those champions, the champions that are doing that, get ahead, the game is very likely to stall out because those things don't progress the game in the same way that damage does, right? And part of it also is the distribution of this, right? It's like we have to make it so that being powerful means that you're good at progressing the game state in some way so that games actually inevitably end in a reasonable amount of time, right? I do want to be clear. I do think there is something cool about like past versions of League where the duration of the game is more variable and like you get to experience a larger variety of game states on average. But at the same time, having that be the case, right? Like say season 2, for example, where a game could end at 20 minutes, but a game could also end at 65 minutes, and those were both things that would happen to you if you played a lot of games, on a regular basis. Uh, One of the dangers of that is that's not very respectful of players' time, right? And historically, when we've done a lot of surveying and like a lot of understanding of like what players actually want, while yes, we acknowledge that giving up that variance in potential and ending game states, there is something we're losing there for sure. We're also gaining something more powerful, which is, hey, the player kind of knows what to expect from a game, like how long it is, and the game is extremely unlikely to go past say in the current game like 45 minutes, right? It's like, especially if you're higher, like at a higher level of skill. And so there's some trade-offs being made here in the interest of uh good sort of, I don't have a good terminology for this, but like good practices around the game, not necessarily good practices for like the most diverse set of experiences that you could possibly have in the game. And in general, we want people, because of all of the defenders' advantages that MOBAs load up on, we want people that get really powerful to be able to uh, progress game states and be good at ending the game. And that's why damage has to outscale durability and damage has to outscale healing. And actually, functionally, part of why Grievous Wounds exists is that we don't want games to stall. We don't want fights to stall. And we don't want it to be the case that you experience on a regular basis someone out healing your damage or out sustaining the thing that you're doing, because the end result of that not only is just going to be really frustrating, of course, but also that combat is going to feel pretty fundamentally broken, and it will be fundamentally broken if someone's out healing your damage, and there's not a powerful answer to that, right? This is part of why Grievous Wounds exists in the first place. Um, is the game breaks down if you can't actually damage someone, right? If you can't meaningfully get some advantage on them, that is one of the main avenues of progressing the game that is cut away from you, right? And obviously there are exceptions to this where it's like, yeah, there are champions with powerful sustain that are going to full heal off of a wave in side lane because they built that way, like Tryndamere, for example. It's like, yeah, he's going to go, Rava or Trundle, he's going to go Rav Hydra off of a wave in side lane and full heal, and he has a bunch of weaknesses to compensate for that, and those are built into his kit of like, yep, those champions are allowed to full heal off of waves in side lane if they build correctly, or build to optimize for that, partially because they have really big disadvantages in other areas of the game. But the dedicated healer class idea, or like the dedicated healer that just like has a lot of really powerful sustain, in a lot of ways kind of fundamentally breaks when you set up a game that is defender advantaged, and getting powerful over time means that you need to progress the game state, right? When you compare this to something like PvP in an MMO, right? Like say, Alterac Valley in WoW or something like that. There's a lot of forcing functions, and a lot of things that do not favor the defenders. But there's a lot of forcing functions for combat that result in, yeah, okay, the healing being really powerful doesn't mean that the game has to stall immediately, right? And even with that being the case, you still had the cases of, in olden days of WoW of like, oh yeah, this Alterac Valley game went on for hours and hours and hours and hours, because there are some cases of defender's advantage, and because there are some cases of healing being extremely powerful. Anyway, don't need to get into detail of all of that, but basically to summarize my thoughts on the space, it's traditional MOBAs with the traditional base structure are extremely defender favored. And so one of the things that compensates for that allows the game to actually end is snowballing, right? Like the person who gets strong is likely to keep getting stronger on average. But we have to be careful about how we let them get strong and how we allow the snowballing, or like what direction we allow the snowballing to go. And so the most powerful snowballing vectors have to be damage for the game to reliably end, is essentially the summary of what I have to get at here. Vamp and its users. So this is something I was talking about recently on stream, and I thought merited its own topic. I've touched upon this topic a little bit in previous Q&As, but I thought it merited its own topic directly here, which is that Vamp in systems versus Vamp on champion kits is very different, right? with champion kits, we have a lot of agency to determine like how are you getting this and how powerful this is. Vamping systems is very different, right? Like this is things like Omnivamp, Lifesteal, Spell Vamp, etc. on your items or on your runes. Uh, it's a lot easier for us to make vamp effects on champion kits because we can moderate them appropriately to the type of champion that's using them, right? And one of the things I pointed out previously is that vamp, which is sort of like I'm defining vamp here in the sort of general sense as you get some percentage of the damage that you're dealing as returned as life. The best users of it are going to be cases with that can fulfill two core requirements. Number one is that you're reliably dealing damage to take advantage of the vamp, right? And being ranged helps a lot with that, right? Like obviously, someone who is ranged is more consistently going to be able to deal damage on average than someone who is melee because being ranged fundamentally means that you have more reliability and more options than a melee champion by default, right? And number two is you need to be durable enough not to get one shot in an ideal world to be the best, like to be a really good user of Vamp, right? And this is why when I was previously talking about like Woda shaped items, for example, it's like these are core battle mage items because battle mages are actually the best champions in the entire game at fulfilling both of those requirements, right? They're champions that build a lot of durability, right? Like this is champions like Ryze and Cassio and Swain that are going to build health or defenses in some way on a large percentage of their early items, right? It's like Swain is going, Rylai's first a lot of games, right? Cassio is often buying a Roa, often going to buy a Seraph's, for the shield, often going to have Rylai's or Leandry's or both, right? Look at Ryze's build, the Roa and the Seraphs, right? Et cetera, et cetera. You get the point here. And so they meet these categories like the powerful vamp leverager status of you're not often going to get one shot and you're ranged and you have reliable consistent damage. One of the reasons why we actually have the Bloodthirster shield, and I actually kind of like the Bloodthirster shield, is that one of the problems with AD carries is that when they buy lifesteal, it's harder for them to leverage it because they can be burst down very easily. And so having the BT shield gives them some contextual value around like, oh, it's a little bit harder to get one shot, which allows you to leverage the vamp. And that means that we don't have to have quite an insane amount of vamp on Bloodthirster, right? Like Bloodthirster's amount of vamp gets to be a little bit lower because the shield is there, which allows us to sort of diffuse the power a little bit out into other areas. We don't need to get into all of that. Anyway, what I'm actually getting at here is that Vamp in systems is really, really, really different from Vamp on kits, right? And so when people say, like, why aren't there good healing items for Aatrox and Warwick to buy? What I say to them is, well, those champions actually don't really want Vamp. They're actually not very good users of Vamp effects or healing effects in general, because healing effects that are based on their damage dealt is doubling down on their success case and not actually helping them in the other cases. Where it's like Aatrox, part of why he needs a lot of haste to function on his modern builds is because, well, you need to be highly repeatable because your damage isn't super reliable, right? Warwick is building a lot of items these days that like help him stick to his target or help him actually get functional burst or survive long enough that he can actually re-engage on a target with his Q or his E or whatever, right? And so Vamp is something that often isn't going to be helpful to these champions because in the cases where they're not succeeding, if they're paying a price to double down on their success case, they're often not going to be able to engage with their success case, right? It's like if Aatrox doubles down and invests a bunch of money and time and systemic effort in, I'm sustaining more, right? He's often not going to be a super functional champion because he won't be super repeatable and he will have really, really low reliability and he'll probably be more burstable because of that, right? He'll have lower durability and he'll have less haste, right? He's paying a price there in other areas that likely makes it so that his core pattern is less functional than it is with other stats that he could have access to. Now, none of this is saying that there can't be items that have a little bit of that in them, right? Like Endless Hunger, for example, I was hoping that it would be good on Aatrox. It's not really, from what I can tell, outside of like situationally fairly late in the game. But Endless Hunger as an item example, right? Like some of the early prototypes were a lot more about the vamp effects. And what I found iterating through early prototypes was that the more and more I focused on the haste and the repeatability of the item, the haste output, right, which is the actual powerful part of Endless Hunger, of like the conversion of bonus AD into haste, the more and more functional the item became. around, hey, there's a bunch of champions that want to be more repeatable, and a little bit of sustain on the side, from the Omnivamp on the item is great, right? And you can have big amounts of it. I can unlock you and have lots of Vamp when you get a takedown, because you're likely to be low after getting a takedown if you are a melee champion, and so that can be really powerful for you. But the core functionality of the item is much more about the stat line, Vamp aside, and much more about the haste on the item, much more so than the uh, core Vamp effect, because making the item mostly about Vamp doesn't get at the users that I intended, like the actual AD casters, because a lot of our AD casters, their damage isn't that reliable, or alternately, they're just looking for ways to make their pattern more repeatable. Like with haste, for example, much more so than they're looking for ways to make their success case more powerful, right? Because making your pattern more repeatable also means your success case is more reliable, but it also means that you get more chances to have a success case, right? And so a lot of this just comes down to Vamp, who the Vamp users are, comes down to how can you leverage the Vamp? Like what happens when you Vamp, right? AD carries, for example, part of what makes Vamp a useful stat on them is that their damage is 100% reliable. They're just going to right click you and attack you. Their damage is very reliable, very consistent. And so they can leverage that to take advantage of Vamp in ways that a lot of melee champions have a difficult time doing, because their damage isn't as reliable. They're not as reliably going to be dealing damage, not as reliably, not going to get stunned once and be forced out of the fight, etc. So hopefully that is sort of useful expansion on this topic. What is your definition of sharp? Talking about Riven scaling and counterplay. So I will be the first person to admit, I think I overuse this. I definitely over leverage this term, and use it as shorthand of referring to things in ways that I think probably aren't great for a lot of my like a lot of the discussions that I have here on these videos or on my stream or whatever. And so for that, I apologize. Basically, I think there's a number of different ways you can sort of look at a definition for sharpness in game design, but there's sort of a couple of core aspects. Number one, sharpness is about variance in outcomes, right? Like something that's really, really binary, like a champion that has very few outcomes, right? I would call them a sharp champion, right? Like someone like Garen, for example, he really only does one thing, which is run directly in a straight line at you and try to kill you, right? Like that's all he does, right? That's a sharp champion. Now, someone who has sharp, like a form of a spell that has sharp counterplay, for example, is something that's like, well, you either have it or you don't, right? Like I'll make a comparison here between something like Fiddlesticks W and Ezreal Q. Fiddlesticks W, the counterplay is very sharp. You either get out of the range, you have a stun to stop Fiddlesticks, or you take a bunch of damage and Fiddlesticks heals a lot, right? That's a sharp counterplay spell, right? Like you either do this thing and get big leverage out of it, or you do not do this thing and the Fiddlesticks gets big value out of it. Conversely, you look at a spell like Ezreal Q, and it's like a highly repeatable spell. There's a lot of variance on each outcome, right? On a case-by-case basis, so the only output is you hit or you don't, right? Like, but the spell is highly repeatable. It's a high variance spell. Like there's a prediction game that for Ezreal going on, right? Like you can hide behind minions. There's a lot of additional counterplay around like hiding behind your allies, hiding behind your minions. Ezreal can fire it at long range, can fire it at short range. It leverages, with the rest of his kit, right? He can E forwards to be higher reliability hitting Q. His Q hitting makes the rest of his cooldowns lower, but it means the next Q is going to come faster, and you both players know that. It is a very not sharp spell in that there are a divergent, like large number of divergent outcomes that can occur from Ezreal casting his Q, right? He can hit, he can miss, he can hit on an unintended target, and then that branches down into how the next Q is used and how the rest of Ezreal's kit interacts with that spell, right? Whereas Fiddlesticks, like he just uses W, right? Like he has to stand still. There's nothing that he can do about that, right? It's, everything is in the opponent's hands, and the spell is not highly repeatable, right? It has some level of repeatability because of the cooldown refund, but it is the case of like it's a really sharp spell. How I would frame it. Riven is interesting because I would say in some ways she is a pretty sharp champion in that she's melee only, right? Aside from her ultimate, she has to get on top of you to deal damage to you, which in and of itself is a sharp thing, right? Like melee champions are sharper than ranged champions because they have fewer options and they have to be on top, most of them at least have to be on top of you or be close to you to actually perform their output, right? And so, unless we give them mobility with extremely high variance, like say Yasuo, for example, the champion themselves will be more sharp because just getting to the target, getting to their target versus not getting to their target is already a really sharp form of variance for a lot of the melee champions, like what I would call like true melee champions that actually have like all melee outputs, right? A champion like Riven, for example, where yeah, Wind Slash is not really something that you're going to be using at range a lot of the time. You're going to be using it very low range most of the time because that's where it's effective. And so the way that I look at Riven is she actually in many ways becomes more sharp over time. You know, some of this depends on what her build is, but the more damage focused Riven builds tend to become very, very sharp because she becomes more and more assassin like. And the thing is, as an assassin like champion, when she's building full damage and not building a lot of durability, like some of her more like past builds have been more fighter item centric. Uh, the more damage she builds relative to durability, the more she becomes like an assassin, but she doesn't have the target access tools of an assassin, right? Like she doesn't have ZW or Talon E or any of these other tools or Rengar ult, like these tools that say, okay, assassin, you can get to your target. It's very easy for you to access your target, right? It's like she has a bunch of dashes, sure, absolutely, she has a lot of mobility, but it's persistent mobility, right? It's not powerful burst mobility that's going to instantaneously take her 800 units across the screen in the same way that like Talon E is going to, or insert your favorite assassin spell or whatever, right? Or from earlier in the video, something like a Shaco Q, right? She doesn't have Shaco Q, and so just getting to her target uh, is a large form of variance that is you got to your target and you can succeed versus you did not get to your target and you cannot succeed, right? And so a lot of what sharpness just comes down to is variance in outcomes and what what you like what can potentially happen and like how the possibilities branch, right? Because with the Riven example, if she doesn't get to her target, she's doing nothing. If she does get to her target, that target is often just going to be dead, right? Like it's not that hard for Riven to kill someone later in the game when she's building full damage. If she gets to her target and the target is squishy, a lot of times that target is just going to be erased from existence, right? And so some of this comes down again, like using Yasuo as an example. Yasuo is actually not sharp in a lot of ways, especially earlier in the game before he buys a lot of damage because his mobility is fairly unreliable. Sometimes he has an easy time getting to his target, but a lot of times he doesn't, right? So if the target's not near a minion wave and they're not knocked up, it's hard for him to get to someone who is 1,000 units away from him. But sometimes they get knocked up by, allied Nautilus or whatever, right? And he has a really easy time getting to them. And especially before he buys a lot of crit and damage and such, when he gets to the target, there's a lot of variance that can happen there around, hey, oh, you eat through the minion wave to get to the enemy Orianna. Can you hit the knockup on her, right? Like, how many stacks of your Q did you have when you did this? When you eat through all these minions to get to the enemy Orianna, right? Does the Orianna have flash to dodge the EQ3 or just the regular Q3? Do you have access to your ultimate, right? There's so many different sort of branching pathways you can imagine for an interaction of Yasuo and Orianna, depending upon where they are on the map. Like how many Q stacks Yasuo has, whether he has ultimate or not, et cetera, right? There's a lot of variance around that. Whereas with Riven, a lot of it is just, does she get to her target? Is her ultimate available? And, kind of, sort of as a faint, extra additional one is like, how skilled is the Riven player and how quickly do they execute their combo? Because when Riven encounters a squishy, especially later and later and later into the game, the end result of that is often, if Riven gets in melee into the squishy, they are exploding instantly. They're going to die very, 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 very fast, right? And if they're more durable, that actually leads to there being a much higher variety of outcomes, right? Like Riven interacting with Jax at 25 minutes, for example, that's a much less sharp interaction because the Jax is durable comparatively to Riven interacting with like a Caitlyn or something like that, right? And so ultimately, a lot of this just comes down to like the way that I think of sharpness is the fewer potential outcomes there are, the sharper something is how I frame this. And there's a lot of different ways of looking at that in design. And again, like I said, I think I do overuse the term, and so I do apologize for that. And I'm trying to improve. Always trying to get better at controlling language in a way that is helpful, is useful. But yeah, hopefully that's a good covering of this topic. Why is Rakan's passive cooldown so high compared to other shield passives like Malphite? So one of the things that I'd like to reiterate here that I say, but I don't think I emphasize this enough, is that different champion kits are different, and the same exact spell on two different champion kits could be tuned completely differently, and that probably would be correct, right? Like different champions have different strengths, different weaknesses, and there's different, even a very similar or identical spell on two different kits, we can use them really differently based on a kit. And so the answer to a lot of questions in this space is just, well, different champions are different, right? They have different needs, they have different asks from different parts of their kits. Even if something looks really similar, it might not be, right? Something like Ezreal's Mystic Shot is or sorry, no, this is a better example. Something like Jin's W and Jinx's W might look really similar. And in fact, they are really similar spells, but the way that those kits use them is actually fairly different, right? Even just small property differences make them really, really, really different spells, like the way that they interact with the rest of the kit around how Jinx uses her W to set up the rest of her kit, whereas Jin needs to be set up for his W to work. Is like very texturally different, even with a very small mechanical difference between the two spells. Anyway, for this specific case, though, there's one really big difference that lends itself to this kind of like very large numerical difference, which is that Rakan's passive is not interrupted by damage, right? Malphite's is. And so the actual reality, like if you looked at the effective real cooldown of these two spells in the laning phase, I would bet you that over the course of, if you looked at like 1,000 random games of Rakan and 1,000 random games of Malphite, the difference in real cooldown between the two for the first like 10 minutes of the game would probably be less than you would expect, right? Because if you just look at the numbers, I don't remember off the top of my head what the cooldown on Malphite passive is, but it's whatever, like 12 seconds, 8 seconds, whatever, somewhere in that range. And Rakan's is 30 something, right? But Malphite's is reset by damage, and Rakan's has a refund mechanic on the cooldown for engaging and interacting with the opponents, right? And one of the key differences here is that the expectation of Malphite is that he's probably a laner. He's probably a solo laner. Obviously, there's jungle Malphite too, which is fine and doesn't really need to interact with the passive in this way. But in lane, the expectation for Malphite is that he's giving something up when he goes and resets his passive, right? You have to kind of be zoned for that to work. And there's some tension around how, like, which last hits do you go for? What do you spend mana on? Do you want to queue a minion so that you don't have to get close enough to your opponent to engage with their damage and, get your passive cooldown reset? Conversely, we want to actually actively reward Rakan for interacting and ask him to stay up and try to look for aggressive plays. And so his isn't reset by damage, right? You could take damage going for a Targon's proc or whatever, and that's totally fine. But it's important that Rakan doesn't structurally for Rakan's kit that he isn't sitting around like standing behind the AD carry just waiting for the opportunity to like E the AD carry and W forwards. We want to actually reward him for playing aggressively, playing up in lane. And structurally, the purpose of the passive on these two champions is very different between the two kits. For Malphite, it's this powerful tool that gives him a comeback mechanism of like, okay, if you're losing lane and you're not CSing a lot, this passive is going to be really, really, really powerful, right? Whereas if you're interacting a lot, the passive becomes less powerful, less potent. And in general, the passive is much better against champions that aren't good at consistently interacting than it is against champions who can interact with you a lot at range, right? Like say literally a ranged champion or a champion that has ranged outputs like a Gangplank or a Rumble or whatever. And so just the way that the two kits are leveraging these things are very different, right? And what the purpose of them is on the kit is very different, even if they look very similar on a surface level of here is a passive that gives you a shield that stays on you permanently until it's broken and then has a cooldown. The way that they're structured is very, 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 very different. Like the incentives on the kit are very, very, very different. And ultimately, that's kind of how I look at this entire structure is just, well, they're different because the kits are different, right? Like the number is very different on Rakan because the purpose of this effect on the kit is just completely different comparatively to Malphite. And that's really the what the answer is going to be for a lot of questions in this kind of space is, well, the kits are using the effects really, really, really differently, and therefore they need to be tuned really differently to represent those effects or what the purpose of those things is or are, whatever. Kazante AD scalings. This is an interesting topic because the original release version of Cassante actually functioned a fair bit differently from the current one, but in a subtle way that I think a lot of players are actually super familiar with. The way that he used to work is that he used to have AD ratios on his spells, and then his ult used to give him AD based on his defenses. The way that Cassante works now is that he has defensive scalings on his spells, and his ult multiplies the damage of his spells, right? What his ult does essentially says your Q cooldown is lower and your W has an extra, bonus true damage multiplier on top of it based on the charge time. And specifically, one of the things that you'll note here is that the damage is Q multiplier is cooldown, so it's just DPS, right? It's not burst, and the W burst addition that you do get is true damage, right? It's explicitly not as good against squishies as it is against more durable targets, right? And that is very much by design, right? One of the reasons why Cassante's kit is structured in this way is that one of the most dangerous things that Cassante can do from a like structural and game health perspective is burst squishies, right? One of the reasons why we've structured him in such a way that a lot of his damage is more sustained and there's a lot of counterplay, like more counterplay on the burst specifically, is that when Cassante as a highly durable champion just walking around normally has the threat of very high levels of burst on squishies, the champion doesn't really make sense from a structural perspective, and the game is deeply unhealthy a lot of the times when that interaction occurs where, oh, you're at 80% health squishy and you got within 600 units of a Cassante who is a full tank champion. It's hard for you to interact with positively, and you got one shot, right? Or you got full CC'd 100, or like 80 to 0 or whatever, right, from that health threshold. And so for me personally, like looking at it now, I don't think fundamentally that the AD ratios uh are like undoable. I just think we'd have to be very careful about how we do them, and we'd have to be very intentional around if we were adding AD ratios, because generally speaking, I am in favor of champions, even if it's very fringe viable, being able to interact with more parts of the item system. And one of the things that I've been talking about recently is with the rise of how successful a mode like ARAM Mayhem has been. It's really valuable for our champions to be able to interact with more systems because that gives them more surface area for each individual champion to interact with things like augments and such, right, in Mayhem. And so I think there's a lot of positives to having our champions, even if it's in SR only like very fringe or maybe even non-functional, like having extra ratios. I do generally think that there is a lot of value in that for the game in general, for arena, mayhem, etc., or for potential fun off builds that people can experiment with, even if they're not that powerful. But I think with Cassante we have to be very careful and very intentional. And I think if we were going to give him AD ratios, I think specifically where I would be looking is the passive, right? Which is, hey, after you hit a spell, your auto attack deals more damage, and the Q, right? Like, which are mainly DPS tools, and the passive in particular is a target agnostic DPS tool that is not particularly good against squishies, right? And so I think there probably is some value in Cassante having AD scalings if we could find a healthy way of doing it. But it's dangerous, right? And I think there's a lot of good reasons why those were removed. And and for the current version of Cassante is that it's a lot safer to make to make a version of Cassante that we don't have to worry about extending his burst potential in any meaningful way, even later into the game, right? Like, because there's a lot of danger in even small threshold differences with this champion, right? Like the difference between Cassante killing you in one CC combo between like from 60% and 80%, that's a really, 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 really big difference, right? And so even small threshold differences can add up to a lot here around how healthy Cassante's kit is and like how functional Cassante's kit is and how dangerous he is when getting close to squishy champions. And so all of this kind of combined, what I'm trying to get at here is basically that um, I'm not saying that we could never do this, or even that there aren't good places on the kit for this. It's just the value of getting AD ratios on Cassante's kit. There is some there, but the value relative to the risk that we're taking um, doesn't seem super amazing to me, right? Like there's some minor value for sure, and like for me personally, if I were working on Cassante, I would probably consider an experiment with these things. Just as on the side, assuming it didn't interfere with any main goals. If I were like working on a Cassante large Kasante like buffer nerf list or whatever, right? If it were me, I would want to be considering these things like should the passive have an AD ratio, should the Q have an AD ratio, right? I think those are legitimate questions that the answer could be yes. But I would probably be pretty intentional and like I might even say, hey, should we be lowering the amount of damage that W does slightly if we want to do this? And does that do harm to the main builds? Like, is that correct, right? Or should we just be adding the ratios with no with no compensation? And is that correct, right? Like, how good should those ratios be? Can we actually make this at all functional in core SR, right? Like, do we ever want a world where he's building a Sundered Sky third item or anything along those lines, or like a Overlord's Bloodmail later in the game, or a Death's Dance, right? It's like, do we ever want that to be an output that he has, or like something that he's actually looking for, or like some system that he's interacting with? And the answer might be no, right? And so then that might lead down a road of like, okay, we probably shouldn't add AD ratios if there's no item that we're happy with him buying at any point in his regular builds, because extending Kasante's damage profile is very dangerous, right? Like, he's getting a lot of innate damage from his kit, and he needs to be trading off an appropriate amount of defenses in order to do so, right? And especially the damage that he can deal in his regular, non all out form. It's important that that is limited in a lot of ways in order to make sure that the kit structure makes sense around. Oh, your ult is trading off a lot of defenses in order to get offenses, and if you're wearing away at that defense, at that difference by building a bunch of damage, I think there's a lot of concerns that come around that of like, okay, does this kit shape actually make sense? And does the tools that he has access to, or do the tools that he has access to actually still make sense in a world where he can build meaningful amounts of damage? If that's actually like anything more than fringe viable. There's a lot of questions to answer there, and I don't have all the answers to this one specifically, but I suspect if we were doing this, at least for me personally, the place where I would be looking is probably the passive and maybe the Q. Where these are more sustained DPS-y effects and more target agnostic effects that will not likely lead to Kasante being significantly better at bursting squishies. That's where I would be looking at this personally. Do you think the burst damage from Titanic Hydra is appropriate? So this is a case where I think on an individual case-by-case basis, I think it is high, but within bounds. When it is combined with certain other effects and late game scaling, I do think that it is probably a bit much, right? I think in particular the combination with Heartsteel, because these items have very high synergy, right? They both scale with health and reward you for building health in your other slots, and reward you for having health scaling in your kit potentially, if you're like Scion or something like that. And the case is that they often line up to trigger at the same time, right? Like, as an example, imagine like a 3-item Mundo with like Heartsteel, Warmogs, and Titanic or something like that runs directly at you, hits you with a cleaver, which does a bunch of current health damage, so you're not even full HP at this point. And then he goes up to you and he goes, auto Titanic Hydra activation, and that involves a Heartsteel proc. And yeah, I do think that specific case is probably too much burst. Is Titanic Hydra the problem? Like, to me, probably not, right? I do think that there are cases of very high burst with just Titanic Hydra involved, even without like, super powerful kit synergies. Like Shen rushes Titanic Hydra, dashes into you and, Qs through you and goes auto Titanic auto or something like that while you're taunted. And that does do a lot of damage, right? But to me, that seems within bounds, right? Like the Shen bought an item that has a lot of its gold value invested in damage, and he's not really getting more total damage out of not a ton of more total damage out of the attack reset. It's just he's doing his damage a bit faster because he's getting to 3 auto attacks faster than he would otherwise, right? Because he has an attack reset one time. And so like, to me, on an individual basis, I don't think that the Titanic Hydra like activation effect is too bursty, but it is fair to say I think that maybe given the combinations that it has with other items, especially Heartsteel, and combinations that it has with other kit effects, right, like Mundo's E, for example, or like Scion's W passive or whatever, maybe it is a little bit too good at burst, right? And maybe there's a cooler version of the item that has a little bit more power in the baseline health scaling on hit and a little bit less power in the activation of the item, and is a little bit less bursty and is a little bit less damage sustained. But at the same time, while I do think that the burst level of like Heartsteel, Titanic, plus health items Mundo is probably a little bit too high, I don't think that Titanic is like fundamentally the root of the problem here, or the place that I would be primarily looking for oh, well, we need to mitigate the amount of burst damage that like Mundo is doing, or that one item Shen is doing, or anything like that. Right? It's like I look at those and I say, well, if that's the problem, like if the burst damage is the problem in these specific cases, uh, is this not just indicative that like Mundo's E is too powerful, right? And that we should have more powerful in the passive and less in the active? Or is this not indicative that Mundo is just getting a little bit too much AD and he should have, he should be a little bit more durable, or he should have a little bit more healing, or whatever, right? Like we distribute power in his kit in other places. I think it is totally fair to say that there are situations involving Titanic Hydra that probably have a little bit too much burst. Fair. And I even tend to agree with that statement. Uh, but while Titanic is a contributor, I don't think it's the primary contributor. And while it might benefit a little bit, or it might be nice to move Titanic a little bit towards sustained damage over the burst active that it has, I do think it's pretty important that the burst active is really satisfying and really like noticeable as the Titanic user. And so I'm not sure how much room we have to go down on the active itself. Um, and still have Titanic Hydra be a like really super satisfying purchase with the attack reset, right? Because on a lot of the champions that are buying this, right, Shen I think is a really good example of this. You don't have a ton of extra burst damage. You're not your auto attacks aren't doing a crazy amount of damage in the first place, and so the attack reset in and of itself isn't going to be able to carry the satisfaction. I think it does need some additional damage on that effect, and so this ends up in a question of like, okay, so if that's the case, how much room do we have to go down on the active? And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, right? It could be a lot, it could be a little. I haven't deeply investigated that, but ultimately, my answer to this question is I think there are cases you could come up with where the burst damage from Titanic is probably inappropriate, but not necessarily just because of Titanic in and of itself, more due to its combination with, certain champion kits and certain other items like Heartsteel specifically. In general, I'm a little bit suspicious of us having multiple health, like, or a lot of health to damage items that can be applied as burst, right? Like, I think it's fine for us to have multiple Cinder items. Partially, that's because you can't stack them, right? And so we don't have to worry about what happens when someone gets really tanky and stacks a bunch of Cinder items, um, and stacks a bunch of health. And it's like, well, that's not an option, so it's not a concern. Whereas you can buy Heartsteel and Titanic, and I think it makes sense in our current structure that you can buy both. I don't think we should lock them out with each other, right? But them both having a lot of similar outputs of like health scaling burst, I think is a little bit like the system is a little bit at odds with itself, of just like kind of rewarding the same scaling vector in ways that maybe aren't correct for us to have, being rewarded so powerfully in the same way across multiple items that can line up and burst people in this way. But I think that's like a minor structural defect, not a major one, to be clear. Why is Triforce MS on autos, but Black Cleaver is MS on all physical damage? Pretty easy explanation for this. Trinity Force is about attacking. It's a Sheen item. It has attack speed. We want to reward you for continuously attacking. Black Cleaver, on the other hand, is intended to be a more generic item that is accessible to casters. And so it is important that it doesn't rely upon you attacking. And the more important thing, of course, is the armor shred. But I think it's actually good that the speed also rewards you for just dealing physical damage and being more accessible to a broader, wider audience. And in general, I actually think that this is just it's about the form and the function of these items, right? Like the form represents the function, right? It's like, hey, the function of Trinity Force is supposed to be about champions that are casting a lot of spells and attacking a lot. And Black Cleaver is less restrictive in that its function is supposed to be about you just deal physical damage a lot, like frequently, and you care a lot about dealing physical damage to your opponents multiple times. Doesn't have to be with auto attacks. You could be a caster, like a Pantheon, for example, right? And it's important that Black Cleaver feels functional for Pantheon. And it's not important that Trinity Force feels functional for Pantheon. And so a lot of this just comes down to, the form of the item is derived from the functions of the item. And so because of that, we have a more restrictive clause, or in most cases more restrictive. There's theoretically ways you could have your auto attack deal all magic damage, I guess. But the form is more restrictive here on Trinity Force because of the function of the item, or the intended functionality of the item. And there's not really much more to it, right? It's like, it's because Trinity Force is for attacking and Black Cleaver is for attacking or for casting, right? Like it kind of is more broad and more accessible because we want the item to be a fairly generic, broadly accessible purchase. If Karma got Wild Rift Ultimate on RR on PC, could she still be a battle mage? So for those of you not familiar, Karma in Wild Rift works a fair bit differently. She has a number of different changes to her spells, but the bigger thing is that she just has an ultimate, which is a giant donut. I actually think that the ult is really cool. I actually was really impressed by the work that Way Too Troll, the designer who did this, did on this. Was inspired by the Karma, like the cinematic, by the way, of like Karma doing some. I don't know if she does a donut or what, but that was what Way Too Troll always said was this was inspired. I was watching the Karma cinematic and got really inspired and made the donut spell afterwards, and it was very cool. Anyway, but the donut, the way that it works is basically after Karma places a giant AoE on the ground somewhere close to her, and after a delay, the outer ring of the donut gets flung. It deals a bunch of damage, magic damage, and the people in it, enemies in it, get flung to the other side. If you're in the center, you take less damage, and you do not get flung anywhere. And it's a really cool spell. I think it actually works reasonably well with Karma's Kit. I think the way that it interacts with her Q and her W are actually both really cool. I think it's a great spell. However, it is not a battle mage spell, right? Like, look at our battle mage ultimates, right? Look at like Swain, look at Rise, even Cassiopeia, right? Cassiopeia is maybe the closest example of a battle mage who has like a sort of burst-ish ultimate with CC on it. But the most important thing for battle mages is that they have a lot of power. Like, they need a lot of power budget in their kits in baseline reliable DPS on their base kits. Or in Swain's case, that comes from his ultimate. Like the baseline DPS, a lot of it comes from ulting as well. But like you look at like Rise or you look at Cassio, and most of the power budget on those kits is just in I deal a lot of very reliable, very consistent damage. And that's really all they're allowed to do, right? Like Rise has a root with a lot of counterplay. And Cassio has some healing and some grounding, right? Like, but and a speed boost to make that functional, like to sort of tie the kit together, right? But most of the power budget on these kits is in I have spells that allow me to consistently deal very high amounts of damage reliably to people who are at medium range, right? And the thing with this spell is that this is like the Karma Wild Rift Ultimate really is more of a control mage tool, control mage spell, or maybe even a burst mage spell, if we wanted to make a burst mage that was really good at team fighting, where we would need to drain a lot of power from Karma to add this. If we wanted to add this ultimate in PC League, we would have to pull power elsewhere because obviously you're just getting an entirely new spell that's quite powerful, right? So the question then becomes, where do we pull that power? And I think the answer ultimately is almost anywhere we can pull power from Karma's Kit is going to degrade the properties that make her functional in some ways towards the battle mage space, right? Obviously, anything we nerf about the Q, like damage, cooldown, literally anything, even mana cost, is going to degrade battle mage power. But even other things on the kit, right? Like cooldowns on the W or the E, the output of W or E, right? Like these are actually things that support the battle mage pattern of Karma in some ways, right? Around like, yeah, well, one of the ways that you can be more functional as a battle mage on Karma is by spam shielding yourself to make yourself more durable, so that you can get up close and get more reliable Qs off. One of the ways that you can be more reliable as a battle mage is by Wing people, so that then your Q will guaranteed land on them, right? Which makes your damage more reliable, right? Anything we nerf about these spells, I think, contributes to a loss of sort of battle mage identity. And the answer that I have here is like, there's probably a champion that has some of Karma's spells and the Karma Wild Rift Ultimate that has that has a battle mage identity, but I suspect that it probably isn't Karma anymore, right? Like it probably doesn't feel like Karma. The number of properties we'd have to change in order to make that work, because there's so much power in just having a gigantic AoE CC. That would be so much power that we would have to drain from the rest of the kit. And I question whether on the current kit, whether which is currently stretching and I would say really is tenuous to even call current Karma a battle mage, right? She has some battle mage properties, but I wouldn't really call her a real battle mage by any means. I think we'd have to really revamp a lot of things on the kit in order to make that functional at all, right? As a battle mage, if we were pulling, like, siphoning a lot of power and putting it into this ultimate. And so my answer ultimately just comes down to, I think the answer is no, if that champion is still feels like Karma. And that might not be the most satisfying answer, but ultimately, like, what you're asking here is like, hey, here's this identity which is fundamentally at odds with this spell. Can this champion have an equivalent amount of this identity with this spell? It's like probably not, because the power has to come from somewhere, right? The power for the spell, right? Like the champions need to be balanced. Therefore, uh, the power has to be drained somewhere. And I don't think that Karma has a bunch of things on her kit that are uh, functional for Karma that are not battle mage forward, right? As an example, we could say Karma is no longer allowed to shield her allies with E. She can only shield herself. That probably doesn't really feel like Karma, but it is a version where we can preserve a lot of the battle magey feeling things about the kit, because battle mages are selfish, right? Like they don't tend to have super, selfless outputs, right? And so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about here, where I think the answer is probably no, as long as it still actually feels like Karma, because the properties we'd have to change would be quite sharp, quite severe. I should not say sharp like that. That's a bad usage. I'm going to try and get better. Anyway, this has been number 31. Thanks for watching, and maybe catch you next time.